welcome to the third part of my Nations video review. The first part was an instructional where I taught you how to play Nations game. The second part was a sample gameplay, runs approximately an hour, shows the game played through the entire age of antiquity, and also shows how to do the final scoring for the game. In this third video, I'm actually going to do my full review for Nations, the board game. Now, normally I don't do reviews, and I break them down into so many videos. I like to keep my videos, and I know they run a little bit long, but I like to keep them as minimum as possible. Now, I knew Nations was going to be a very long video review, so I knew I'd have to break it down into 3 pieces. And actually, this is kind of a test run. If this test run goes okay, I'm actually going to do a full review for Dominant Species, which is another very long, very intensive game I like to describe as a brain burner. And after I do Dominant Species, my eventual goal is to do a full review for Through the Ages, which is basically the granddaddy version of Nations that Nations is kind of the spiritual successor for. Again, if I get good feedback on the Nations review in this format, and again, I do realize it's long, and I appreciate you standing by and watching all 3 of these videos and going through this long video review. But if enough people show appreciation for Dominant Species and Through the Ages, are definitely going to be coming forward as future reviews. Now, in the first video, I teach you how to play Nations, the board game, but to give you a quick overview, Nations is a civilization building game which concentrates on more of an economic side of things. This is a game where the person who's able to most efficiently use what the game throws at you to create the most efficient empire is most likely going to be the winner of the game. This is a combination board game and worker placement game where during the game players are going to be having to track various things such as the heritage of their nation. They'll have to track their military, they'll have to track the nation's stability, and they'll also have to keep constant track of the player order, but luckily you get some extra bonuses you can add to your empire to make things a little bit easier for you, especially if you're playing against other players who are a lot better than you. It's kind of a nice built-in leveling system, and if you ever played Civilization, the computer game, you understand exactly what that section of the board is exactly for. In Nations, each player controls their own empire where they're going to have to control their workers, and they're going to be placing their workers along various parts of their nation board. These workers are going to give them things such as heritage, they're going to give them food production, they're going to give them ore, they're going to give them stability, they're going to give them military might. But the trick is you don't start with all these workers. Adding these workers to your empire is going to add a drain to your empire, so you have to constantly balance the drain caused by creating these extra workers versus the benefits they're going to give your extra empire. Plus, you're also going to have progress cards that are going to go through the 4 various ages of your empire, from the age of antiquity all the way up to the industrial age. These cards are going to be added to your empire board, whether they're colonies that are going to give you permanent resources because you've conquered them, whether they're wonders which are going to give you victory points and additional benefits to your empire, all the way through advisors, great discoveries, and various other things you're going to add to your empire. Although I must emphasize, Nations does concentrate more of the economic side of things, so some things are overly abstracted, and that would be wars and also battles are going to be overly abstracted, which is kind of something you may want to consider before you play Nations, especially if you were somebody who played Through the Ages. If you played Through the Ages and you loved how military worked, you are going to be frustrated by how overly abstract it is going to be in the Nations board game. The nice bonus about the Nations board game, though, is it plays up to 5 players, and it's not going to be a 5-hour game. While I love Through the Ages, I think it's a fantastic game, and it's one of my favorite Civilization computer games in a board game format. I do dread the fact that playing that game with 4 hours is an exercise in stamina, as it can run many, many hours. Nations, as a nice bonus, plays 5 players in about 2.5 to 3 hours, something that Through the Ages cannot do. Nations, the board game, retails for $100, and you can usually find it online for a cheaper price. I personally got my copy for about $62 from Amazon, and I'm just going to come out right out and say it. I think $100 is very high for this board game. Now, granted, this game has a lot of replay value in it, and there's going to get a lot of enjoyment out of this game, especially if you enjoy these kind of games. You're going to get many, many hours of this game, but dollar for component, the price value is definitely not there. Now, granted, you can easily argue that dollar per enjoyment, you may want to consider a game for that aspect. I'm going to counter argue and say that that's ridiculous, especially when you start looking at things like card games. Are you going to spend $100 for a card game? Okay, let's take the Magic players out of the equation here and just figure, are you going to play $100 for a deck of cards? Probably not, and you're probably not going to spend $100 for the components that you get with Nations. If you can find it online for about $65, that's a pretty good reasonable price for this game. I think what this game's actual retail value should be about $70 to $80. 80 on the high end, especially if you compare it to games like Dominant Species. And through the ages, for the amount of components you get on the box, I think $80 would have been a better suggested manufacturer's retail price for the game. Now, onto the components themselves. The game does actually come with quite a bit of wooden components. You're going to have wooden components for all the players of the game. 5 different players. You're going to get 13 wooden meeples for each player, plus 5 player discs in your player color, which is going to be used for the scoring board. And these are good quality wood, good thick, nice, decent quality wood. Nothing to complain about there. You're also going to get a lot of cards. The game comes with hundreds of cards, literally. And now these are the smaller kind of cards that you get in your Fantasy Flight style games and games along those lines. And while the thickness quality of these cards is pretty decent, they're not too bad. They're pretty good thickness, especially for smaller cards. The negative of them is the fact that the artwork on them is, I'd say, I'm going to describe it as more of a style of artwork. Most of the artwork on these is reused, especially when you look at the battle cards, and also when you look at the colony cards, which is just basically a very overly basic little cutout for a section of the world, such as Libya. You see it's basically a two-tone color for that one. And you see a lot of the artwork is not the best artwork you can imagine. The golden advances, you're going to see books. Your military men is going to be a pretty simple artwork. Again, not terrible artwork, but considering, again, we're spending $100 for this game, I wasn't too impressed with the artwork that comes with the game. Again, it may have been a style choice that I decided for the game, but I wasn't overly impressed with the artwork for the cards. Although I will give one pro bono for the cards. They did a nice little touch to make it easier to sort these cards. Now you're going to notice as the cards go through the ages, the pigment on the color gets a little bit darker, which makes it a lot easier for sorting. And also there's going to be a number on the bottom of the card, again, which makes them easier for sorting. If you get them all thrown in a box at the end of the game, it's easier to sort them back into the Age 1, the Age 2, the Age 3, and the Age 4 decks because they are marked and they're color coded. And it also works for the event cards, same thing. They're numbered and the pigment on the cards gets darker, making them easier to put them together. Now the solo rules actually doesn't use cards. These are actually cardboard tokens. And again, if I get enough feedback from people requesting me to show them how to play the solo rules, I'll definitely make sure I do that. But these are cardboard cards instead of actually little cards for the regular game, and they're good, thick cardboard. And actually the cardboard on these is as thick and maybe a little bit thicker than the cardboard used for the actual game boards themselves. Now, speaking of the game boards, they're not overly thick. They're thick enough to the fact that they're not overly bendy, but you can see that I can actually flex these boards. So you see that they're not overly thick. Now, they're not terrible. They're not as thin as the actual nation boards, but again, going back to the $100 price tag, I expected a little bit higher quality on the components here. Again, not horrible, not terrible, but I expected a little bit more. And then finally, we have the nation boards themselves. Now, there are 5 nation boards, and again, this is the flimsy cardstock paper type of stuff. They are double-sided, and each nation is going to play different. All the A sides for all the boards are going to be exact matches for all the nations, but as soon as you flip them over to the B sides, you notice that every nation is going to be played a little bit differently. They're all going to have their own special advantage. For example, Rome starts off with 2 military. They're going to have that military for the entire game, but they're going to start off with less food. They're going to start with less victory points, and you're going to notice that they only have 4 spaces, 4 buildings and military. And again, all these nations play a little bit differently. Nice touch. I'm glad they added that into the game, but it would have been nicer if we had better card stock for the nation boards themselves. The game does come with player aids, which is always a nice touch. There are 4 player aids, and again, this is a 5-player game, so if you're playing with 5 players, one of the players is going to have to share those. Not a terrible thing, because literally once you know how to play this game, you can pretty much play it without these player aids, so not a big deal. Their double-sided front shows you how to play the game. The back side shows you how to score, and these are actually thick cardboard. Interesting enough, they're thicker than the nation boards, but that was the decision they made there. And the game also comes with a lot of cardboard. It's thick, good quality cardboard for all the components, including these oversized cardboard bits that you're going to use if you get past level 50 on the nation board. Again, there's only 4 of these, like the player aids, so if you happen to have a 5-player game and all 5 players get past the 50 mark on the heritage board, you're going to have to find another way to keep track of that part when you're playing the game. Now, my final thing I want to comment on is going to be the rule book itself. Now, the rule book is, I'm going to say, is slightly inadequate, and it's I think my point on the rulebook is going to be emphasized when you realize there's an FAQ you can download for nations, which is actually 7 pages. Now, a lot of the pages in here are superfluous. You don't need all 7 of these pages, but this FAQ does one thing that the rulebook does not do. It takes all the event cards and specifically explains how those event cards work. And some of these explanations are very, very important, and you're going to give, they're basically different interpretations of what the cards say. They explain how the cards work, and I would actually say that without this FAQ, I can guarantee that you're going to play some of these event cards wrong. I'm not saying it's possible. I'm going to guarantee you're going to play some of those event cards wrong. And actually during my sample gameplay, I actually bring out that point with one of the event cards, which is very easy to guess wrong when you're playing the game. So I'm going to definitely say that if you're buying nations, find the FAQ, get the most current version. It is 7 pages long. Download it, print it out, put it inside your box, keep it with you, because it definitely explains all these event cards. And again, you're looking at tons of event cards, tons of advancement cards. You want to have that printed out in your box anytime questions arise. Other than that, though, the rulebook does an adequate job of teaching you how to play the game. There's one glaring error in the rulebook, and I think I mentioned that during one of the earlier videos. Other than that, the game is not too hard to learn to play from the rulebook, except for the solo game. I thought the description for the solo game was slightly ambiguous, and I would actually say it's ambiguous enough that don't even try to figure out the solo game until you've actually played the game a few times and it makes sense. Then you can try to tackle the solo game, and even then you may have a couple judgment calls on your part, but once you play the solo game a few times, you're going to figure out how to play it, and it's going to make sense to you, and it's not that big a deal. Overall component quality, as I said, I don't think this is a $100 value on this box. I'm getting $100 worth of play value out of this game. Yes, I agree on that aspect, and I won't deny that aspect, but I'm not going to say that I'm getting $100 worth of components in this box. Definitely not. Every time I do a review for a board game, it's very important for me to take a few minutes to comment on the optimal player count for that board game, and also take a few minutes and comment on the family friendliness of the game. How family friendly do I think the game is? Now, while a lot of board games these days, actually all of them, pretty much say the minimum suggested age for each board game, it's not always, in my opinion, 100% accurate based on exactly what the contents of the box are. Some games may say a minimum age of 10 that can be played by a 5-year-old. Some games may say a minimum age of 12 that may be a little bit too suggestive for a 12-year-old and probably should be better for a 14-year-old. So I would like to take a few moments to make a couple comments on those things, just so you know exactly what you're getting into when you buy a board game. Now, Nations lists as a game for ages 14 and up, and I think this is one of those times when that's 100% spot on for the suggested age. This game is extremely challenging, it's extremely in-depth, it has a lot of things going on, and this is one of those games that you have to be constantly strategizing your turns based on what the game has given you, and you need to be most efficiently using what the game has been giving to you. This is not one of those kind of games where you can foolishly and bullheadedly pick one strategy and stick with it for the entire game and hope to pull out a victory, unless somehow by some miracle the cards that come out on the progress board just happen to be in your favor. And the chances of that happening are slim and none, just unless you're one of the luckiest people out there. This game also requires you to constantly using math. You got to be constantly factoring everything in. You got to be constantly balancing everything in. And this game is one of those games that will let you minutely micromanage your entire empire and contemplate every single move you're going to make, which I'll get into this in a moment, can really lead to analysis paralysis if you let it happen. But that just goes to show how in-depth this game is. This is a very challenging game to play. Once you know how to play it, the instructional part of it is not overly challenging. And as a matter of fact, this is one of those games that once you know how to play, you're pretty much going to know how to play it for the rest of the time you're playing board games, because everything flows very nicely, and the one player aid with the round summary that comes with the game is done very, very well and breaks everything down. Matter of fact, the only thing I think anybody would ever forget to do when they're playing just by looking at the round summary is just remembering that during the growth phase, growth is done in reverse player order, not in regular player order. That's the only thing that this little round summary doesn't actually state. Other than that, the backside even shows you how to score. So I think once you know how to play this game, you can pretty much live off of this and never have a problem playing this game ever again. My contention is that this game is just, I'm going to be honest, it can be a brain burner. It's a very challenging game. Great game for what it is, but it can be very challenging, so I definitely will not recommend this game for kids under the age of 14. You can probably get away with a 13-year-old, a fairly bright 13-year-old could probably play this game efficiently, but I wouldn't go too much younger than a 13-year-old. Now, on the important topic here is the perfect player count for Nations. Now, Nations is a pretty interesting beast when you want to sit down and factor the player count for Nations. Nations as a one-player game is done very well. They did a very good job incorporating some rules to allow you to play the game as a solo game where you're playing basically versus an AI player based on the randomizing of these cards right here. There's 6 of these that you're going to have for each age, and you're basically going to see 2 of them for each age that you play through. So it's going to randomize every time you play it. And basically the way it's going to work is you're going to roll a die, and some things are going to happen. The board's going to change. And again, this isn't the tutorial for solo play. But just know that they actually include a fairly competent AI for you to play the game solo. Now, your strategy is going to be played a little bit differently when you're playing the solo game because the progress board can be wiped out pretty quickly just based on the roll of the dice. But again, as a solo game, the rules are done admirably very, very well. I think they did a great job including the solo rules in this game. I also think they did a great job making this game play at the 4 and 5 player count. Now, the 5 player count game does modify the rules just a little bit, and basically it's just modifying the most and the least aspect of the rules, so it's not a major change. And the nice thing about the 4 and 5 player game is this game does not drag on too much longer the more players you add. Now, this game is going to average about 45 minutes per player, but it's going to be a sliding scale, and it doesn't add too much time towards the 5 player spectrum of the game, to the point that you can probably get a 5 player game down in about 2.5, maybe 3 hours tops. And the reason why is because a lot of the cleanup in this game is going to be performed by all the players at once. So adding players isn't going to add too much to the time there. The basic addition of the player time is going to be from the action phase, and again, adding more players will add to that. But again, the cleanup and the prep phase is not going to increase its time span based on the extra players, which is definitely a very nice touch. Additionally, I also like the fact that when you get 4 or 5 players out, you're going to fill up this progress board, which means you're going to increase the chance of the cards you need appearing coming out in the game instead of possibly still being stuck on the deck, hoping they're going to come out to help your strategy. Now, while granted there may be more competition for cards when you have more players, I'm going to restate the fact that the more players you have, the more progress cards you have, the better the chances are you're going to get a more variety of these cards, giving you more opportunity to see more variety of strategies and preventing the potential, and you're going to see this when you watch my sample gameplay, of one player basically being screwed because they chose a poor strategy in the beginning and no cards were ever coming out to help them compensate for the poor strategy. So they basically fell further and further behind, and basically there was no chance at one point where they can ever catch up. And that's one of the problems you're going to have in this game when you get the lower player counts. And this is why I like the higher player counts in this game, because you get the more variety with the progress board. Additionally, with more players, you're going to notice that wars are going to be much more lucrative and they're going to be much more effective in this game. With the lower player count, wars are actually counterproductive to use fairly routinely. Now, I'm not going to say they're always worthless, but in a 2-player game, a war can be next to worthless against another player, especially if one player is going for a military strategy and the other player is going for a pure stability strategy. The person with a stability strategy is going to counteract the amount of resources you put into that war, and they're going to end up basically on top most of the time, except for a few circumstances with some basically a perfect storm of progress cards. Maybe that won't happen, but generally, and again, I play this game close to 20 times now, so I'm just taking the averages of what I've personally seen. I have seen that the averages in a 2-player game, you're basically going to notice that the amount of resources you throw into creating a war is not going to be enough of a negative to affect the person who's going the non-war strategy and going for the stability strategy. It's just not worth it. But in the 4 or 5 player game, wars can definitely be worth it. They can definitely be lucrative to you. And definitely you're not going to feel like you're wasting resources trying to create a war. In my opinion, the optimal player count for Nations is a 4-player game. I like 3 players. I also like 5 players. I enjoyed it a lot. But I am actually at the point now, and this is after multiple tries trying it, I will not play Nations ever again as a 2-player only game. Matter of fact, I still am keeping Through the Ages. I'm not getting rid of Through the Ages. I will own both Nations and Through the Ages. But if anybody wants to play Nations 2 players, I'm going to flat out say no, and I'm going to pull out Through the Ages. And if they don't know how to play it, I'm going to teach them how to play it, because I prefer the way Through the Ages does it as a 2-player game versus Nations, just because I know in Through the Ages every single card is going to come out. In Nations, I don't know if that's going to happen. I've noticed too many times in Nations where just a bad randomizer of the progress board has screwed one player over to the point in a 2-player game that there is no way they can make a comeback. And that may be just me, that may be just my bad luck, but again, I play this game multiple times with 2 players, and I have seen every single time I play this game as a 2-player game, I have seen one player fall so far behind there is no way they can catch up. And the end game was a foregone conclusion. We were both just basically going through the motions, getting to the end of the game, and you usually saw by halfway through the 3rd age, you knew who the winner was going to be, and it was just basically a foregone conclusion. I didn't like that aspect as a 2-player game, and it's why I won't play Nations ever again as a 2-player game. But on the other opposite end of the spectrum, I'll probably never play Through the Ages as a 4-player game ever again, because Nations as a 3 and 4-player game, well, let's just say with a 4-player game is a much better experience. If I had only 3 players and I had to pick between Nations or Through the Ages, I would basically sit down and decide just how much playtime I had, because a 3-player game of Through the Ages is going to take longer than Nations. And I also judge it basically on the players I had, because Through the Ages, a little more aggressive a game. Nations more of an abstract for the aggression, so I judge on my player group. But if I had to choose between 3-player games, Nations or Through the Ages, I couldn't pick one. 4-player games, I would pick Nations every single time, and as a 2-player game, I would pick Through the Ages every single time. Nations was a very interesting review for me to do, simply for the fact that Nations is designed by the same company that did Eclipse. Now, when Eclipse first came out, not to harp too much on the past, but when Eclipse first came out, it was basically touted as a Twilight Imperium 3 killer. I picked up Eclipse under the assumption that it was a Twilight Imperium 3 killer, basically Twilight Imperium 3 played faster. So I picked it up and had high hopes for the game, and I'm sure you can understand that if you went into Eclipse expecting to be Twilight Imperium 3, you're going to be greatly disappointed, and I was greatly disappointed. Now, I went on to play Eclipse multiple times, and while I can appreciate the design of the game, I can appreciate how well the game is designed, how tight of a game it is, and the fantastic work that went into designing a very well-designed game that definitely deserves its place in the Board Game Geek rankings. Unfortunately, Eclipse as a game never grew on me. Now, it's not because the game is bad. It is a fantastically designed game, and I will repeat that 100 times if I need to, but it was not a fantastically designed game for me. I saw what they were trying to do, but I thought it was much too economical for me, so it just never stuck for me. Nations at first felt the same way for me. Nations, when it first came out, was touted as a Through the Ages killer, so I was very hesitant to pick up the game at first. And the first time I actually played Nations, I didn't really enjoy it that much. Basically the same thing. The hype and the anticipation didn't satisfy me the way I thought it would. I went into Nations expecting Through the Ages, just like I went into Eclipse expecting Twilight Imperium 3, and just like Eclipse, Nations at first disappointed me. Basically, I'm going to start out this review by saying that if you're a Through the Ages player, don't go into Nations expecting Through the Ages played faster. It's not. Matter of fact, Nations belongs in a collection even if you own Through the Ages. I will say it again, if you own Through the Ages, you will probably enjoy owning Nations, just don't expect Nations to replace Through the Ages. The games are similar on some levels, but they are very different on other levels. Nations is quicker playing, but also abstracts a lot of things, and it definitely has a different feel from Through the Ages. Now, I'm not going to spend the rest of this review harping on the difference between Nations and Through the Ages. There's quite a few people on Board Game Geek who have done just exactly that, and they probably do it more elegantly than myself. Go check them out. Nations itself is a fantastically well-designed game that rewards the ability to budget resources to a razor's edge. And this is a game that deserves to stand on its own merits and not be constantly compared to another game that was designed 5 years ago. This game deserves to stand on its own. But I'll also add on to that, though, that if you are a Through the Ages player and you enjoy Through the Ages, but you can't get it to the table because you can't handle the amount of hours you must dedicate to it because you have 3 or 4 players who want to play it, Nations is an admirable surrogate to the enjoyment you can get from Through the Ages. But again, it still plays different. Now, I like how Nations does a couple different things that you won't find in other games. One of the coolest things I think about Nations is the addition of the multiple player difficulty levels. Now, it seems like such a minor thing, but it can make one heck of a difference. Matter of fact, every time I teach Nations to new players, I always put myself on King level and put everybody else on Chieftain, just to keep an equal footing between myself and the other players so we all get an equal challenge. And I think it's a fantastic inclusion for the game, and it's also a nice throwback to what these games are all based on. All these games are basically spiritual board game successors to Sid Meier's Civilization, the computer game, basically played as a card game or a board game. And it's a nice throwback to those games because that's exactly what Sid Meier's Civilization computer game has. The names of the difficulty levels are verbatim actually matches. Although I will be honest though, sometimes with the right progress cards, this section, this difficulty level can become fairly a lot less impactful because sometimes you'll just get the perfect progress cards which are going to allow you to take a work every round and not have to worry about the free resources. Now, it's very rare that will happen, but when that does happen, the difficulty level is not going to matter at all because you're going to be taking the free worker, not worrying about the resources, and you're basically getting the same results as every other player. It can happen, it's rare, but it's going to depend on a perfect storm from the progress board. I've actually only seen it happen twice in the times I play this game, but it can happen. I also like the addition of the historical footnotes they put on all the cards. On the war cards, there's some historical footnotes on the top that tells you the year that the card is based on. And it goes for all the cards from the Great Wonders, the leaders, the advisors. It tells you exactly when they lived and everything like that. It's a nice little touch, and hey, who says board games can't be educational? It's a nice little touch. I like it, and I actually learned a little bit of history, and I'm kind of a history buff as it is anyway, so it's kind of a nice addition for me. I also like how the game concludes more than enough cards to guarantee you're going to have a lot of replayability in this game. Take the event cards. You're only going to use 2 events every time you play the game per age, but there's 12 event cards for each one of the ages. Extra replayability there. Take the progress cards. You're not going to use all these progress cards even in a 5-player game. There are just way more progress cards than you will ever access, and it's definitely going to add to the replayability of the game because no 2 games are going to play ever exactly the same. Sometimes you're going to get a game with a lot of military cards may pop up. Sometimes you get a game with a lot of colonies are going to pop up. Sometimes you're going to get good advisors, bad advisors. You're going to get buildings. Sometimes it's going to match up. Sometimes it's not. But you're definitely going to have the variety there. And it's a very nice touch that they included excess amounts of cards. This game is also very easy to teach for a Civilization style game. Now I can take, and again I don't want to keep harping back to it, but I can take Through the Ages and I can teach players how to play that 2 or 3 times, and it's going to be about the 3rd time before they're really going to get the hang of the game. Nations, on the other end of the spectrum, I can teach it once and everybody knows how to play it, and then I can go a month without playing it, bring everybody back, and everybody still remembers how to play it. It flows that well. The game is just designed very, very well to flow perfectly that way, and again it comes with a pretty darn good player aid which teaches you and reminds you how to play the game. I also like how there's multiple ways to score victory points. You're not pigeonholed into one strategy to try to gain your victory points. And also I like how there's card combinations that may occasionally pop up on your progress board. And if you're paying attention, you can get some really good card opportunities that's going to give you some really great combinations. Some good ones that work together are Abe Lincoln plus the Statue of Liberty. You get both those out in play, you're going to get a really nice bonus. And those go throughout all the ages. And finally, as I said in the player count, the game does come with a really good solo AI mechanic. Now, it can occasionally be random and can be occasionally fairly brutal, especially with a couple successive really bad dice rolls, but it's the randomness of the dice. But overall, on average, it works out very well, and it's a good challenge, and it's kind of a nice little side way to enjoy the game. Again, it plays a little differently, but it's definitely a fantastic inclusion. They didn't have to throw it in here, but they did, and I really like it. Now, this is a lot of high praise for the game, and the game does deserve it. This game is going to shoot up the rankings on Board Game Geek. Don't be surprised about it. It definitely is going to deserve a very high ranking, probably in the top 100 on Board Game Geek. It's probably going to land there and stay there for a very long time and deserve it. But the game, in my opinion, is not without its warts. Now, the first big thing I've already covered, I definitely don't think the dollar value is worth it there. I don't see a $100 value on this box. Yes, you get a lot of gameplay in there, but there's not $100 worth of components in this box. I just don't see it. I'm sorry. Also, the first couple times you play the game, expect to constantly, at least once or twice, forget to adjust your military track when you move one of your workers off one of your military spaces. Expect to forget to adjust your stability when you move one of your workers off one of your stability spaces. Just expect to do it. It can be a little bit confusing because you have your squares that happen immediately, and then you have your circles that happen during your progress phase. It's kind of a learning step. Just understand it's going to happen. Don't get upset. It gets much easier the more times you play the game. I'd say by the third or fourth time you play the game, you probably won't forget anymore unless it's getting too late at night from a long game. But generally, that's something that's not going to happen once you play the game a couple times. And now we come to the biggest negative I have with Nations, the board game itself. I appreciate that they were trying to shorten the gameplay, and that caused them to have to overly abstract some things. But I think they crossed the line by over abstracting some things. Now, the biggest thing I have a problem with in Nations is the military. In a two-player game, I think military, when it comes to wars and stuff like that, is next to worthless. I don't think wars are even worth anything until you get to maybe a 4, possibly sometimes a 3-player game, but generally in a 4 or 5-player game, that's about when the wars are going to start being worthwhile. And I really don't like how overly abstract the wars are. It doesn't feel like you're going to war against another nation. It feels like you're going to war against the board. And it's very easy for, as soon as that war card comes out, every other player knows what they need to do. And every single player, as soon as they see that war card come out, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to mathematically figure out that what is the most efficient thing to do. Do they take the bad end of the war because they know they have the stability and they take the damage? Or do they just pump up the military temporarily and just ride the storm out and not get affected by the war? It's overly abstracted, and I'll be honest with you, the first couple times I played Nations, it drove me absolutely crazy. And it was one of the things that almost made me stop playing the game because I just couldn't get past the hurdle of how much it infuriated me, how overly abstracted wars were in Nations. To me, in my mind, you can't have a civilization game without wars. It's just a factor of a civilization building game. You have wars. You go to war with your neighbors. It's overly abstracted here, and I never once felt like I was going to war against a neighbor. I basically felt like I was throwing out a card that had the potential to be a hindrance to other players, but thematically, never once did it ever feel like I went to war against my neighbors. Also, along the lines of the abstractness, I never really felt like this was a nation-building game. Thematically, there is a nation you're building here, but I never once felt like I was taking my nation through multiple ages. Basically, I just felt like Age 2 was better cards than Age 1, Age 3 was better cards than Age 2, and Age 4 was better cards than Age 3, 2, and 1. I never really felt like I was taking my empire from the Stone Age or from the Age of Antiquity all the way up to the Industrial Age. It just never clicked for me. Now, don't get me wrong, this game is mechanically fantastic. It's mechanically really sound, but it concentrates much more on the economical side of things, which made it feel less like a nation civilization building game and more of an economical game. And this feeling was just definitely increased by the randomness of the progress boards. There are just some occasions where the progress cards will not come out with what you thought your nation should be. For example, in my mind, if I'm playing the Roman Empire, I'm going to war. It's just in my mind, I'm Rome, I need to be aggressive, I need to start attacking everybody. And I never really felt like I was in 100% control of that. I basically felt like I was trying my best to be the most efficient with what the game has given me, versus in my mind playing what my empire was. I wasn't doing that. I was playing what the board wanted me to play, not what I wanted my empire to be. Now, taken individually, these may seem like minor little thematic things that shouldn't be a big deal, but when you incorporate them all together, it makes this game feel less like a nation civilization building game and much more like an economic game. Now, that's not a bad thing if you want an economic game, but if you want a true nation civilization building game where you're taking your nation from way back in time all the way up to the modern age, this is not going to be that game that's going to give you that feeling. If you want a game that's a really great economically, very tightly mechanically built, very well designed, almost to a razor's edge, Nations has that in spades, but it does not have the theme. And the abstractness of the game continues on bunch of different layers for this game. The military was overly abstract. I already covered wars, how overly abstracted they were. Colonies were overly abstracted. You raise your military up high enough just to get the colony. Once you got the colony, you dropped your military back down because it was too expensive to keep your military going. Now, while some people may say that's thematic, in my mind that's not that thematic, that if you go out there and conquer another country, pull all your military back out, and still that country is still sending you its resources. To me, that's not too thematic. I mean, I can imagine that if a country is conquered, then everybody pulls all the military out. They're going to say, why are we giving you our supplies? You're not here no more. We're going to rebuild our own infrastructure. Again, that just goes on to add to the fact that this game is much more of an abstraction on some of the things that I didn't want abstracted in a game for me, at least not in a Civilization game. I am going to repeat what I said before. I think Nations is a fantastically designed game. It is designed literally to a razor's edge, where you can sit there and on your turn literally math out your actions to the perfect amount to make sure that the event cards are hitting you just the way you want them to make sure the wars are hitting you just the way you want them to make sure that all the cards are coming into your empire just the way you want them to. But again, the game, even with its very tight mechanics, over abstracted some things to make this game feel less like a Civilization game and much more like an economic game. The bottom line here is that Nations is a well-designed game with lots of expansion potential, possibility of more civilizations. This game deserves to literally to skyrocket up the charts, but you need to know going in that this isn't going to replace Sid Meier's Civilization for you. It's not going to replace Through the Ages for you, and it's probably not going to replace any of those Civilization building games at all. Nations is through and through. It's a take on an empire building game, emphasizing the economical side of things. This game is firing all 12 cylinders. Unfortunately for me, this is a race car, and I went into this wanting a muscle car. There is absolutely nothing wrong with Nations the game if this is the kind of game you're looking for. If you're looking for an economical game, this is a fantastic, absolutely beautifully designed economical game. Seriously, if what you've seen from what I've shown you here intrigues you, you need to run down and pick up Nations. You're not going to be disappointed. But if you want less abstract and more direct feeling of an actual Civilization building game, probably still want to stick with Sid Meier's Civilization the board game, or possibly even Through the Ages. This has been another off-the-shelf board game review, looking at Nations the board game, a Civilization building game for 1 to 5 players. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Also, let me know what you think about this format of the longer videos. Again, this is going to judge whether I'm ever going to do a review for Dominant Species, and also possibly eventually for Through the Ages. Thanks again for watching.